Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to attend our second of three webinars discussing the conservation easement for the Garst family farm sale. My name is Chris Eddy, Realtor and Manager of Community Insurance Agency in Coon Rapids. Together with People's Company of Clive, we're pleased to bring you several high-quality tracts of farmland owned by the Garst family of Coon Rapids. Representing Peoples today are Steve Brewer, President, and Matt Adams, Realtor and top producer. They're both on the phone call with us. As all of you know, and the reason why you're here is that there will be a first of its kind soil conservation easement that will be placed on the farms with the intention of preserving the existing erosion control structures and enhancing soil health on all of the tracts. Today's focus will be to offer some insight about the conservation easement, answer some of your questions, and introduce the individuals that have been involved with creating the easement and will be involved with monitoring the easement. We previously had a webinar on August 5th. That webinar is recorded and available to watch on YouTube. Our next webinar will be on August 13th, and only the people that have been selected for the live auction will be invited to that webinar. Before we start the meeting, there are a few housekeeping items we need to discuss. All attendees have been muted. We will accept questions in writing at the end of the meeting. There's a question bar at the bottom of your screen, Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions in there, and we'll address those when we get to the end of the meeting. This meeting will also be recorded and posted on YouTube. Should be up there within the next day or so. It's pretty easy to find. Search for Garst Farms Auction Conservation Webinar, or you can go to the Farm Auction website, and there'll be a link that'll take you directly to the YouTube page. Questions that are not answered during this meeting will be addressed in the next day or two, and we'll try to post responses on the website. We do have a list of questions and answers on the auction website that were posed during our conversation with buyers and in the previous webinar. There's a lot of good information there. Questions can be submitted to me, and my email is chris.eddy@commins.net, or you can also submit them to Molly at People's Company, which is MOLLI@peoplescompany.com. Our first presenter of the day is Dr. David Muth. David oversees People's Company's asset management platform and works with land managers to develop strategies for their managed farms. David grew up on a family farm in north central Iowa, understands the economics of farming. He's trained as a mechanical engineer and received a PhD from Iowa State University. David's presentation will discuss conservation techniques that have been utilized on these farms, and why these techniques are going to be profitable to the new owners. Please take it away, David.
Thanks much, Chris. So I wanted to give a little bit of an asset management perspective on what the conservation practices that have been implemented historically really mean for the farm going forward, and a little bit of a picture of how we see this as being a useful tool and a powerful tool for positioning the next owner to be responsive to market conditions and pressures that are coming at us right now. So we'll quickly walk through just a few things. When we step back and we think about the objectives of the practices that the Garst family has implemented, primarily the erosion control structures, keeping the soil in place, no-till practices, cover crops, being sort of the leading practices that are really being implemented historically. There's a few outcomes that we're chasing. One, we want to improve that top end potential, right? That maximum yield that we can get out of the farm. The flip side of that is we want to increase resiliency when we run into these higher stress situations. So we want to raise the bottom end. We want to make sure that we're protected and able to react from a soil health standpoint when Mother Nature throws some curveballs at us. We also want to reduce that variability across soil types that we can see in different fields, so we have consistent productivity and consistent profitability across all acres. And then this is an important piece that's coming at all of us in agriculture at a very fast pace. We want to be able to proactively address some of these changing consumer values on the products that they're buying within the food supply chain. So let's step into a quick example here. These are a couple of the assets that are part of the auction in Audubon County. And what we're looking at here is the yield history, which is really rich for these farms. There's been a lot of really excellent data collection over the past 20 years. So for each farm, as compared to the Audubon County average reported by USDA NASS. Now we have our challenges associated with taking a single data point and comparing that to a large spatially distributed data point. Certainly we all know that weather conditions, highly local events can be impactful on a given year. But in general, what we can see here is we're starting to really get the benefits that we talk about as being our targets. So we look at the Bonnie Kluver farms, corn and soybean yields over this time frame. What we see pretty clearly is that top end potential is there. We're seeing better top end yields. We're also seeing in several cases better resiliency when we have some challenging growing conditions. And probably as important as anything for a potential acquisition is the yield trend lines. We are seeing the corn and soybean yields increasing at a faster rate than what we see in the county. This is a really beautiful case study over a long term, showing how these practices can kind of create these kinds of outcomes. Another farm, the Nix Reds here in Audubon County, we see similar patterns, right? Some higher top end potential, several cases where we have some of that resiliency in higher stress situations. But most importantly, that trend line is growing at a faster pace for both the corn and the soybeans. Now, as per common, right, corn's is a little bit more responsive to these practices and being able to see these yields increase at a faster pace, but we do see the same trends with soybeans on these farms also. So there we get a nice example of achieving the outcomes that we're targeting in terms of better top end production, more consistent production, and some resiliency that's popping out. Here is an example, these same two assets looking at a vegetative index map. This is a late season vegetative index map, and this is telling us it's a pretty good indicator of where yield's going to pop through. And we see solid, consistent production across the farm. Certainly the vegetative index from the erosion control structures that are out there, you can see those lines cleanly in the data set. But what this allows us to do is understand, all right, we've created a soil health environment where we can be consistently productive and profitable across a range of topographic and soil type kinds of conditions. Really important for long-term profitability. And we see those outcomes and certainly appreciate what that can do for us. Now, another piece that's really important, and we spend a lot of time working with how we manage assets to be responsive on this front. When we look at this image to the lower left, right, these are all of the food labels and brands that we're buying in the grocery store, convenience store, et cetera. Really, they're controlled by about 10 companies globally, right? And every single one of these CPGs, these global food companies, have explicitly identified sustainability goals. This is an example from General Mills. And this is being responsive both to their investors in the marketplace and also to consumers that want more transparency and are putting different values in terms of social responsibility on the food products that they're buying. So in this context, the conservation practices that have been implemented to date on the Garst farms, as well as the easement going forward, in a lot of ways, we'd look at it not as restrictive, but as creating a platform by which we can be really responsive to these outcomes that are in the market. And we think that in the fairly near term, we're going to start to see pressures around priority access to the marketplace if we can show that our products are produced with these kinds of practices, generating these kinds of outcomes. And certainly these farms are well positioned to be able to gain that priority access in the marketplace based on the practices to date in the easement that we're all talking about here today. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you, David. Very good information, much appreciated. Our next presenter is Paul Morph. Paul is an attorney with Simmons, Perrine, Moyer, and Bergman out of Cedar Rapids. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1997 and joined the SPMB in 1998. Paul has extensive experience in wills, trust, and estate planning. Also serves as legal counsel for nonprofit entities. He is a current board member for the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and past board member of the Iowa Trust for Land Conservation. Paul is the primary author of the conservation easement that's being placed on the farms and will offer some insight into its creation. Go ahead and take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Chris. So this has been a great project to be involved with. One of the more exciting things I've gotten to do recently, especially in conjunction with the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and county conservation boards. I've worked on a lot of conservation easements, but this is kind of a new model where we're really trying to do this for soil health and water quality, to honor the land in a way that is beneficial to the state and the earth, but also allow it to be utilized for agriculture in a way that's economically productive. So a conservation easement is a creature of state law. It's not something that had existed at common law. And so Iowa Code Chapter 457A authorizes the creation of perpetual easements, which is interest in land, and essentially gives the easement holder or grantee, in this case, White Rock Conservancy, the right to enforce the terms of this recorded agreement. And White Rock Conservancy, which will hold this easement, is a nonprofit organization I've had the pleasure to be involved with for quite a while, that the Garst family created in Coon Rapids. It exists to support the missions of the Leopold Center, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, and those organizations appoint a majority of the board. And so that organization will hold easements, and it's directly tied to these kinds of complicated mission that combines sustainability and agriculture. So White Rock, as the grantee, will have the right to enforce the terms of the easement. This easement is on a very narrow chassis. We are not restricting anything except as necessary to maintain these goals of open space, water quality, soil health. And so the structure of this easement, and all of these are available on a portal, you can read them all, is basically to give the grantee, White Rock, certain very narrow rights to gather data so it can monitor the easement and, if necessary, enforce its terms. The key provisions in this document are the permitted uses and the prohibited uses and the enforcement mechanism, the dispute resolution mechanism. And then there's also an amendment provision, which does allow for changes that are not deleterious to the conservation values of the property, but as circumstances change over time, allow this to adapt. So to start out with the permitted uses, that's the most important, probably that and the prohibited uses. All agricultural practices are permitted as long as they don't violate 5 restrictions we'll come back to. So that includes row crop agriculture, forestry, permaculture, hay production, grazing, aquaculture, participation in CRP and other government programs, and any other kind of agriculture you can imagine. And so there are just there are 5 limitations on this. The first is there's a requirement that there be no-till methods for row crop agriculture, and that is fleshed out further in section 4D. And then there is also a requirement of continuous living roots in the soil, which essentially means for row crop agriculture, you have to have a cover crop in place in a season where there's not a row crop in the ground. And that is fleshed out in paragraph 4E. Then there are a lot of erosion control structures, terraces, riparian buffers, grass waterways, headlands, and so forth. And those are all mapped, and they're part of the baseline data. For one farm that is currently in CRP, which is the Patrick Farm, there is a map of what erosion control structures would have to be implemented if it were converted to row crop agriculture, which is permitted. And so those have to be maintained, or if there are deviations from those, they have to be approved by White Rock, and they have to not result in a diminishment of the soil health and water quality protections that the current erosion control structures afford. The fourth limitation is a livestock density requirement. Basically, you can graze this, you can put up fences. By the way, you can put in tile. There's already tile. You can enhance the tile as long as there's a plan to avoid erosion during the process and restore the land to its soil health that it had before you implemented those changes. But grazing is permitted. The limitation is a density requirement, and you cannot have, on average during a year, more than one animal unit per 1.5 acres of ground. And that term animal unit is defined, and it is tied to manure management plans at the state of Iowa. And there's a link to the chart that allows the conversion for different kinds of animals. And then the fifth limitation is structures. And we're talking about structures other than fence, tile, and erosion control structures, but other kinds of structures, basically buildings, can be built of any kind in any nature within the building envelopes. And the only other limitation would be if it was some sort of an animal feeding operation, it could not put the entire property out of compliance with the animal density requirement. But that building envelope is a rectangle, can be any shape of a rectangle, skinny or fat, it could be a square, and it will be 15 acres in size. And the winning bidder at the close of the auction will have 5 days, so until August 22nd, I believe, to delineate where that 15-acre building envelope will be placed on the property. And for 3 properties, there can be more than one 15-acre envelope. The Reds Farm in Audubon County is allowed 2 such building envelopes, and the Bonnieland Clover East and the Bonnieland Clover West properties, which are quite large, are each allowed 3 such building envelopes. And so the buyer gets to decide where those go within 5 days. Once those have been selected, the easement will be completed with that buyer selection. The current owners, Garst Supply or Bonnieland, as the case may be, will then donate the easement. It will be recorded, and at the time that the sales close, the buyer will take subject to the easement. And the purchase agreements, which are also available for you to view, all reference the fact that the buyer has had a chance to review the terms of the conservation easement and agrees that they will take subject to that easement at closing. A couple other limitations. There's no limitation on subdividing the property. You can break it up and sell it in bits, but every time there's an additional owner created by a subdivision, there's a $20,000 payment to the White Rock, because there will now be more easements that have to be monitored, and there will be some additional expense, and that $20,000 will help endow the costs of that additional monitoring. Additionally, every time there's a transfer, for example, if you buy a property at auction and then reconvey it, there's a $2,000 fee. And that is, again, just to defray the costs of White Rock related to that transition. It's not punitive, it's just to try to keep them harmless. So prohibited and permitted uses all relate to that. You can't build outside of those building envelopes. And then the last thing in permitted uses, any and all other practices that do not interfere materially with the conservation values of the land are permitted. So very broad. Nothing is prohibited outside of certain agricultural practices and building outside the envelopes, unless it's going to interfere with open space, soil quality, water quality. And if there's a disagreement about whether a non-agricultural practice does materially so interfere with the conservation values, or if there's a dispute about whether a certain practice is tillage or the living roots requirement is being met, there are several paragraphs to talk about how that is resolved. And in every occasion, we've tried to avoid courts. So first, there's a requirement that the parties try to work it out. If they can't work it out, we have recommended that it be referred to somebody like the USDA or university expert to arbitrate it. Either party can always require arbitration, but eventually if White Rock thinks that the owner is just not complying, is not planting cover crops, is tilling, they have the right to enforce those requirements, and their attorney's fees, if they're successful, would be reimbursed by the owner. So this does have teeth, it does matter. You should read it carefully. I think it's drafted in such a way that if you're farming responsibly, as long as you're willing to do no-till methods and have a cover crop on in the winter and not diminish the erosion control structures, you can farm it essentially however you want to. We have added some language since the last Zoom conference to try to make that absolutely clear. We have added language providing, for example, that injecting of fertilizer into the soil, as long as it's done in a method that is not disturbing the soil more than is necessary for that practice, is permitted. So manure, anhydrous, whatever you're applying, if you want to inject or knife it into the soil, that is expressly permitted. We've added language about fence and tile to make clear that's permitted. Also, there was a request by someone that we make available compliance reports so that if someone has borrowed money or is trying to borrow money and they need to prove they're in compliance with the easement, that they can get a report from White Rock. So the easement will be amended. This will be added later today or tomorrow. They will be monitoring the easement at least annually and will be preparing a compliance report. But upon request by the landowner, a copy of that compliance report will be sent either to the landowner or their lender. And so if that helps at all with financing, the White Rock will do everything in their power. If you have questions about this, or if there's anything that concerns you, please let us know. We'll be available for questions. And then there is an amendment mechanism. So as practices change, if there are new ways of applying cover crops that are less expensive or more effective, certainly those kinds of things can be dealt with. Also, if a building envelope needs to change in the future and it can be done in a way that doesn't interfere with the conservation values of the property as a whole, with White Rock's consent, those kinds of things could happen down the road. I think that's a pretty good summary. I think I'll throw it back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, very good, Paul. And the basic message here too is that the easement was written to mimic how the farms have been cared for in the past. And so, they've been no-tilled for years, cover crops since 2013. And these have all been very profitable and productive farms for the Garst family, as seen by the yield history that's on the website. So the protections in place are there for the fact of maintaining, all the hard work that's been put into making these farms what they are. So our next presenter is White Rock Conservancy. White Rock has been selected to monitor the easements. They are a 5,500 acre nonprofit land trust created in 2004 by the Garst family based out of Coon Rapids, Iowa. White Rock's mission is to improve the condition of conservation land through appropriate land management, to demonstrate sustainable farming methods, and to provide educational recreational opportunities for visitors. Easement monitoring will be the responsibility of the land manager, Carissa Shoemaker, and then the longtime farm manager, Darwin Pierce. Carissa will present for White Rock today. Please take it away.
Hi all. As Chris said, I'm Carissa. I'm the land manager here at White Rock. I started in April, and I've been working over the past few months to develop White Rock's easement program in collaboration with some longstanding staff and board members with decades of experience in sustainable ag and also conservation easements. Our team is especially well versed in these conservation practices that Paul outlined that are in the easement, given that White Rock was founded on a donation of nearly 5,000 acres of Garst land. And given that we continue to farm about 1/3 of our land, that's roughly 800 acres of row crop and about 1,000 acres of pasture and hay. As with the land up for auction, we've been no-till since the 80s, and we started experimenting with cover crops in 2008 with full adoption in 2013. We also maintain a variety of erosion control structures, including waterways and terraces, contour grass strips, all sorts of things. We're driven by soil health above all, but we're also, it's really important that we generate revenue from this land to support our organization, and we do. We receive over 50% of our annual income from farming. So we feel we're pretty well positioned to support the new landowners and farm managers in adhering to the easements and continuing to build soil health on these farms, whether that's through data collection and assessment or having conversations about conservation practices. And we're also well positioned physically. We're just down the road from Tract 8, and we're between all of the other tracts, an easy drive for new land managers and us to talk it out in person, or we're also easy to reach over the phone or via email. And then before I wrap up here, I just want to note that we've had some questions about whether staff turnover would affect the easement and its enforcement and monitoring and conversations with landowners. And I want to assure you that it largely will not, because decisions around the easement are made in collaboration with the board of directors, which, I mean, as was explained by Chris up top, and Paul manages decision-making at White Rock Conservancy. And then it's also, the decisions are made more by data than individuals. So we would only start to have conversations about changes to management practices as we see soil health begin to deteriorate. That's really the core of this easement. So thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email or phone.
Thanks, Carissa. And to her point too, we've had a lot of questions about who are the people that are managing. Well, as I mentioned, one just presented, and Carissa is in our community. She's very visible. She's local. Darwin Pierce has lived here all of his life. These are people that know the farms, that are confident in what they're talking about, and they want to work with the landowners for the success of the easement and the promotion of soil health. It's nobody's goal to end up in a courtroom. And so I believe that the resource that White Rock brings to this is very important. So our next presenter is Liz Garst. She's the spokesperson for the Garst family. Liz has been surrounded by agriculture her entire life, growing up in her family's pioneering seed corn business and eventually leading the family's business and farming entities. Liz lives in Coon Rapids and has been a longtime advocate for protecting our most valuable resource, which is the land. She regularly speaks on the topics of soil health, carbon sequestration, and preparing for a changing climate. Liz and her family created the idea of a soil health easement, and she'll provide the background of why it's such an important part of this sale. If you haven't seen her video, please visit the auction website and click on the link. Liz, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I've been asked a lot lately, why are we doing this? And I'll indiscreetly tell you that I just had my 70th birthday and I don't have anyone else to take over our farming operations down the road. So wanted to deal with what will we do with our land while I'm still able to be the person handling it. We sold a lot of land when my dad died to pay off debts he had and out of that, we were pretty disappointed to see what happened to some of the land we had put decades into improving. A lot of the land we sold got converted from pasture back to row crop, and waterways, et cetera, got taken out. And we just don't want to see that happen again. I think everyone in my family is really keyed into the importance of good soil to have a good future. And we're going to need to make some changes in a lot of agriculture in Iowa to prepare ourselves for the future. Climate change is real. And as I think most farmers here know, those 7-inch and 5-inch pounding rains are part of our new reality. And the kind of farming we're practicing here, it's set up to harden these farms for the future. I think that a lot more farmers will need to be doing what we're doing already, which is getting these farms ready to take a harsher environment. Our soils in Iowa are not doing very well because they've been so tilled, and we've not been taking care of the soil biotic community, which makes healthy soil, and healthy soil is knit together and doesn't erode, unlike a lot of the soils we have now in Iowa, which are washing away with each heavy rain. So we're eager to see our hard work remain, and we're eager to see Iowa's agricultural future get better, not worse. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Liz. So we've been getting a lot of questions about the easement, understandably so, as people take a look at this and examine what's in it. So the next part of the presentation, I'm just going to read through some of the questions. These are all questions that have been generated either in our discussions with buyers or during the previous webinar. So I'll just start with number one here. Molly, if you could go ahead and put up the questions, you guys can read them on your screen too. Are there any restrictions to anhydrous application, and can it be knifed into the ground? As Paul mentioned, wording was added into every one of the agreements that specifically excludes injection of manure and anhydrous and other fertilizers as a tillage application. So yes, anhydrous and manure application are permitted and they're protected by easement. The one restriction to that is that the wording says the ground shouldn't be disturbed more than what is practical. And so the easement protects application in a small band, a knifed application of that fertilizer. What constitutes one animal unit? Again, as Paul mentioned, refer to the Iowa DNR manure management plan form. Essentially, one animal unit is a mature cow, or 0.4 hogs, or there's several different designations based on weight and the amount of manure that the animal creates. What happens if cover crops can't be planted into the fall? Owners and operators need to communicate with the easement monitor. Impossible weather conditions or other acts of God will be dealt with as practically as possible. However, cover crop placement is expected by the easement, and it'll be enforced until the ground's frozen, even if germination would take place in the spring. What are the baselines that will be used to confirm compliance with the easement? Existing soil testing will serve as the baseline with special attention to soil organic matter and soil aggregate water stability results. The farms, there's quite a bit of information about the existing fertility of the farms. That testing is available from Midwest Laboratories. And then the test for soil aggregate water stability is called the SLAKE test, SLAKE. And that testing was performed by Regen Ag Lab out of Pleasanton, Nebraska. Are the baselines set at the inception of the easement, and do they stay in perpetuity, or are the baselines currently being achieved on the property? And the long-term expectation is that if the farms are continued to be farmed as they have been, with no-till and cover crops, that soil health will continually improve. So the baseline is what the existing condition of the farms is. And so, question number two, are the baselines currently being achieved on the property? Well, our conservation easement is new. And so as is condition represents the baseline. And so the answer is yes, they are being achieved. Is continuous corn allowed, or does the crop have to be rotated? Continuous corn is allowed on the property. If a farm is split, will a new conservation easement be created? The answer is yes. The easements will need to be modified as necessary to update legal descriptions, revise the conservation structure language, clarify the owner of the building envelope, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there will be a cost to update the easements. Will the buyer be required to sign an easement document on the day of sale? The answer to this is no. The Garst family will sign the easement prior to the sale. So Bonnie Land and Garst Supply will sign the easements and give those to White Rock Conservancy. That'll happen before the auction and before the property is transferred to the new owner. And then those easements are binding and upon future owners of the land. What is a building envelope? Again, a building envelope is a 15-acre parcel on which a structure or structures could be placed. Depending on the size of the tract, as Paul mentioned, there could be more than one. And we need to identify those building envelopes within 5 days of the auction. Another question that's come up is, can you build a windmill in the building envelope? Yes, there's no restrictions to my knowledge as to what can be built inside the building envelope. Can changes be made to existing terraces or tile? Yes. Changes should be submitted in writing to White Rock Conservancy as to why that change is equivalent or better than what's already there. We'd suggest using NRCS resources or private consultants to help bolster the landowner's request with proper documentation of why that's an equivalent or better design. There should be no issues with making change. What is White Rock's process for handling requests? All communication goes through Carissa or Darwin Pierce. Maintenance issues like tile blowouts, erosion control, or other items can be dealt with on site. They don't have to go to a board of directors. Deviations from easement language or major changes to existing structures would have to have approval by the board of directors. Next set of questions were asked during the easement webinar. What if 3 people buy a parcel and split it, farm it as one, but each owns separate portions? Are they each subject to the $20,000 cost for splitting? Likely yes, but there could be co-ownership situations where the fee does not apply, such as ownership under an LLC, or if the property owners are joint tenants and tenants in commons with respect to the entire parcel that's being sold. What if there's no CRP enrollment at the time the contract expires? Can the CRP be farmed while no enrollment is available to keep crop history and acres eligible? The CRP that's on tracks 1 through 7 must be maintained as is, even if it's grass. So there's no reduction in CRP or grass acres, and there's no increase in crop acres on tracks 1 through 7. As Paul mentioned, tract 8, the Patrick farm, can be broken out and farmed. That's subject to the proposed contours, headlands, and erosion control structures that are identified within the easement for that farm. Livestock can be grazed, subject to the density provision that's in the easement. CAFOs are not allowed on the property because they would likely exceed the livestock density provision. What's the difference between tillage and fertilizer application? The tillage is a breaking of the topsoil that disrupts the soil structure and contributes to soil erosion. Fertilizer application is done in strips with minimal disruption to soil structure and minimal potential for erosion. Will soil testing be required on a periodic basis by the landowners? When landowners and operators perform soil testing as part of their normal agronomy program, the results will be shared with White Rock Conservancy. So White Rock Conservancy on their own will additionally test for soil aggregate water stability at no cost to the landowner. This is the slake test that I mentioned earlier. The frequency of that test will be determined. We've performed one set of tests already on the farms, and another one will be performed later this fall. Will the purchase agreement be available prior to the sealed bid deadline? The purchase agreements will go on the auction website, I believe later today or at the latest tomorrow. I just sent those to Peoples to add to the auction website.
I just got a message that they have now been added. All
Okay.
the purchase agreements are in the data room.
Very good. Thank you, Liz. These are all drafts, but unless there are suggested changes to the language, I don't anticipate them to change. On the outcomes slide are the county average yields, the average for the entire county on all the soils. And as David mentioned, yes, that's the data that was used is the NASS data, National Agricultural Statistics Service, that's referenced for the county yields. And those are the yields without regard to soil types. Are the measures and data to support soil health as mentioned in the baseline readings, the current soil tests? The current condition of the farm will represent the baseline, as I mentioned earlier. Can volunteer trees, fence lines, terraces, buffer strips be removed and controlled, not including the protected grove? Yes, any trees that are in the fence lines or in the terraces can be removed. Only the trees in the grove on the Bonnie Clover farm are protected indefinitely. There are some trees along the ditch on the Nix and Reds farm that are protected until the CRP contract expires in 2023. And there is a nice grove of walnuts down there that could be harvested someday, which would be a benefit to the owner. Can the owner apply for cost share on cover crops? And the answer is yes. White Rock mentioned experimentation in the first webinar. Is experimentation expected on these tracks? The rest of the question, but the answer is no. If a landowner wants to experiment with something, I'm sure White Rock would be open to that. They're an organization that enjoys collecting data and promoting research projects that are going to increase our knowledge base. But these farms are not experimentation farms, and that's not expected of the owners if they don't want to do it. What type of soil testing will White Rock be using? As I mentioned, that's the slake test with Regen Ag Labs out of Pleasanton. Do all cover crops have to be ground incorporated, or can they be aerial applied? The best practices and preferences for ground incorporation. If conditions indicate a likelihood of success, aerial application will be permitted. If you have the high sealed bid on more than one tract, and these were not raised at the live auction, but you want one tract over the other, are you stuck with both tracts? The answer to that is yes. If you have high sealed bid on two tracts and no one else raises you at the live auction, you will own both tracts of land. So I've talked to a lot of people about how to bid on these farms. And I'll be honest, I mean, that's not an easy question to answer. If you really want to go hard after one farm, then you need to be aggressive on that farm. But I guess my message to all the serious buyers is get in the room, right? I mean, you don't want to be left out of the auction. And so if you're looking at more than one tract, if you're looking at more than one tract, maybe it's not a bad idea to put an offer on several with some strategy on how to get in the room. Again, that's a really difficult question to answer. So let's see here. Can cattle manure be stockpiled in the summer and spread in the fall, as long as it's done according to the NRCS DNR requirements? Yes, cattle manure could be stockpiled. Imagine the NRCS is going to require you to control runoff from that pile or whatever other rules they might have. But there's no restrictions in the easement about stockpiling cattle manure. Are there cover crop density requirements and seeding rates? Yes. Pretty easy to do a search for the NRCS data that refers to the different seed mixes, seeding rates, timing of the seeding. There's a lot of good information available out there. Are wind turbines encouraged or discouraged, or is the easement neutral? And the easement is neutral on this. It doesn't care if you build a wind turbine or not, but they have to be constructed within the building envelope. Can the cover crops be harvested? Yes, they can be harvested, hayed, or grazed, subject to determination guidelines for your crop insurance. There's no restrictions on how the cover crops are handled in the easement, other than they can't be terminated too early. I believe more than 14 days prior to planting. Will online bidding be available for the auction? Yes, a live bidding link will be set up for approved bidders. That'll be a protected link. This isn't open to the public. So if you want to bid online, Peoples is working on that and will provide you with a link. Who's seeding the cover crops in 2021? The Garst family is coordinating planting and paying all costs associated with 2021 cover crops. So the owners that buy these farms, this first year cover crops is free. Is strip tillage allowed? And per section 4D of the easement, tillage of any kind is not allowed. And so yeah, I've had quite a bit of discussion on strip tillage, but by definition, it's not allowed. So you shouldn't be bidding under the basis that you can do that. You know, maybe after you discuss with White Rock what you're proposing to do, and they see your methodology, it could be a permitted practice. But for the purposes of bidding, I think you would need to assume that it's not allowed. So that's the end of the questions that I've got written down. I would open it up for any questions from the audience here. We don't have any at this time. But I give you a few minutes here to type in a few if you'd like. You know, as we've had discussions on this with buyers, you know, that there's all different kinds of opinions on the easement. Some people are tillage people, and something like this doesn't fit in their wheelhouse. And I certainly understand that. But the way the easement has been drafted and created, it does allow for these farms to be farmed in a way that's profitable to the new owner. And cover crops and no-till are no longer, you know, ideas that are not widely accepted. I mean, there's a lot of folks doing these things and they're doing them well. And so I believe that the provisions that are being asked in this easement are something that are going to benefit the future owners. And for the people that know how to do these practices and have the right equipment, they're not going to skip a beat owning these farms. They're going to be high quality tracts that are advantageous to put in your portfolio. So let's see, no questions yet. I know Steve and Matt are on the call. Do either one of you have anything to mention here before we close out the webinar?
I know I can't do the thing. Start video.
See, Matt, are you?
I was gonna say, Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can now. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sorry, I was having a little tough time getting unmuted. You know, Chris, the only a question that I've had that I thought would be good to address is, you know, the 15-acre building envelope that that a buyer is able to kind of place where they would want that. I had a question the other day about, can that 15-acre envelope be split up? Can there be a 5-acre envelope on maybe one side of the farm and a 10-acre envelope on the other side of the farm? And I think the preface of the question was to see if they could have a building site there at some point in time, but still have a grain bin site or another building site on another part of the farm. Is that anything that we've addressed?
It's my understanding that it can't, but Paul, I guess I'm going to defer that question to you. Does the 15-acre building envelope need to be in one location?
As drafted is a single rectangle.
Okay.
Okay, no, that's good to know.
But it can be subdivided, right, Paul?
Yeah, yes, if in that 15-acre envelope, you wanted to do some sort of conservation sensitive neighborhood and plot off 10 lots for people to live in, and the county approved it, there'd be nothing to prohibit you from that. You would have to pay a $20,000 fee to White Rock for each additional owner that subdivision created.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Otherwise, Chris, I haven't received any questions. I mean, there's been a fairly consistent line of questioning that we've had, and I think we've addressed them all either in the previous questions and answers and then today as well. So I haven't received or fielded any questions that haven't been addressed already.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, we've had a lot of phone conversations. The the remainder of today and tomorrow we'll be busy as people get their bids submitted. And we field any phone calls from buyers that are interested. So please reach out to us privately if you have questions. We certainly thank you for your time to understand the easement. I think it's a really important part of the sale, and appreciate your interest in these Garst farms. So with that, we'll end the webinar for today, and look forward to opening the bids and seeing who's going to be joining us for the live auction. Thank you all.
Thank you.